Let's jump right into this explainer. If you've ever flipped that single, thin page between the Old and New Testaments and thought, wait a minute, what just happened? Well, you're definitely not alone. It's like a massive historical pressure cooker. To put this into perspective, that one blank page represents 400 years. I mean, that's literally longer than the entire history of the United States. So, what actually went down during this massive historical gap? People love to call it the 400 years of silence. But as we'll see today, these years were anything but silent. Honestly, they were deafening. We're talking about a relentless period of constant warfare, deep cultural seduction, horrific persecution, and a frankly miraculous rebellion that forged an incredibly resilient cultural identity. Before we get into the weeds, just take a look at the sheer number of massive empires that swept through this tiny, super strategically located strip of land over these 4 centuries. You've got the Persians, then the Greeks, a really brief window of actual Jewish independence, right up to the heavy, heavy hand of the Roman Empire. The turnover here is just staggering. You can almost feel the constant whiplash the local population must have experienced, you know? It's like global superpowers were treating their homeland as a revolving door. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the return from exile, then look at Alexander and the Hellenistic influence. After that, the Great Seleucid Crisis, the Maccabean Revolt, and finally, the Hasmonean dynasty.
Okay, part 1. Return from the exile, rebuilding a fractured identity.
Now, you might think the return from Babylon was this big, triumphant homecoming, but it was actually a really tough struggle against local opposition and, frankly, a lot of internal apathy. The absolutely crucial point here is that even when the Israelites were finally permitted to return home, a huge chunk of them simply never did. The trauma of the Babylonian captivity had fundamentally changed them, right? They had built prosperous lives elsewhere. And this created a permanent diaspora, which basically just means a scattering. From this point forward, the majority of Hebrews lived outside the physical boundaries of Israel, and this completely reshaped their society. Since they were separated from the actual physical temple, their religious focus shifted deeply into the localized study of the law. This is a huge pivot because it's what ultimately gave rise to the synagogue system, a totally new local gathering model that completely redefined how they worshipped as a community. Now, for the folks who actually did return, it took a specific decree from the Persian king, Cyrus, back in 539 BC to make it happen. Cyrus essentially reversed the old Babylonian policy of mass deportation. His whole theory was that subjects are way easier to rule if they're content and living in their own lands. Makes sense, right? So he let groups led by figures like Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel head back and reinstate their ancient sacrifices. But, and this is a big but, instead of the glorious second Exodus they had all envisioned, they came back to a tiny, impoverished temple state. And on top of that, they were immediately met with fierce opposition from the locals, especially the Samaritans. This sparked bitter territorial tensions that would just smolder for centuries. Moving right along to part 2, Alexander and Hellenistic influence, the Greek tide. So here's the thing about Alexander the Great. He didn't just want to conquer your land, he really wanted to conquer your mind. When his armies swept through the region, they didn't just bring weapons, they brought an absolute cultural tsunami. This was Hellenism. And you have to understand, Hellenism was an incredibly attractive yet totally insidious cultural force. We're talking gymnasiums, massive theaters, Greek philosophy, the Greek language, and entirely new styles of clothing and civic life. This huge wave of modernization really started pulling at the fabric of traditional Jewish life, especially among the upper classes and the priests. They rapidly started adopting these Greek ways of living just to gain political favor, which, as you can imagine, created some massive cultural friction. And then, Alexander dies. His generals divide up his sprawling empire, and Judea finds itself trapped directly in the middle. They were quite literally the geographical meat in a geopolitical sandwich. To the south, you had the Ptolemaic Empire down in Egypt. To the north and east, the Seleucid Empire over in Syria. Because the most lucrative trade routes ran right through the Judean hills, their homeland became an actual battlefield. For decades, control just bounced violently back and forth between these two superpowers. And the local people, they were continuously dragged into these massive imperial wars that they didn't start and honestly wanted absolutely nothing to do with. Which brings us to part 3, the Great Seleucid Crisis, assimilation to annihilation. All right, enter the villain of our story, the Seleucid ruler, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Things escalated dramatically when his empire finally took firm control of the region. He takes the throne, desperately needing funds to pay off a staggering war debt that his empire owed to the Romans. So, what does he do? He plunders the Jewish temple for its gold, just brazenly plunders it. Then, to crush any potential rebellion, he stations these hostile, heavily armed troops right inside Jerusalem, in a fortress called the Akra. And then he decides the absolute fastest way to control the local population is to violently erase their distinct culture and forcefully mandate Hellenism across the board. At this point, this was no longer just about paying taxes or navigating foreign politics. This was a deliberate, calculated attempt to completely annihilate a religion. You can literally feel the tension building as his decrees took effect. Antiochus violently stopped the daily temple rituals. He ordered their sacred scriptures to be hunted down and burned. He made observing the Sabbath or circumcising children a capital crime, punishable by torture and death. And then, for the ultimate unthinkable insult, he erected an altar to the Greek god Olympian Zeus right inside the Jewish temple and sacrificed a pig on it. Now for part 4, the Maccabean revolts, fighting for survival. As you can guess, that level of devastating, systemic persecution was the exact spark needed to ignite an explosive and, frankly, miraculous armed rebellion. It all started with this highly cinematic moment in history. Out in a small town in the Judean foothills called Modane, a Seleucid officer tried to force an aged Jewish priest named Mattathias to offer a pagan sacrifice. Well, Mattathias flat out refused. He drew his weapon, killed the officer, and shouted this iconic battle cry: "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." And that was it. That was the absolute point of no return. Mattathias and his 5 sons fled straight into the desert, and the resistance officially began. The progression we see here is just staggering. They went from a ragtag desert militia to an unbelievably effective resistance, and eventually a fully independent state. After Mattathias died, his son, Judas, who was given the incredible nickname Maccabeus, which means the hammer, takes over. Judas was a tactical military genius. He launched a brutal, highly successful guerrilla war against the massive, heavily armored Seleucid army. Against all odds, by 164 BC, Judas and his men literally fought their way back into Jerusalem, cleansed the temple of all the pagan defilements, and rededicated it. This incredibly joyous moment of survival, that is exactly what's still celebrated today as the Festival of Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. But the fight actually didn't end there. By the time Judas's brother Simon took over leadership, he brilliantly used a mix of diplomacy and military might to force the Seleucids out completely. He officially removed the yoke of the Gentiles and made Judea a fully independent nation once again. And that leads us to our final section, part 5, the Hasmonean dynasty, the price of power. You know, independence was incredibly sweet, but the story takes a pretty dark and quite ironic turn right here. The persecuted essentially became the conquerors. The leaders of this new independent Jewish state, which became known as the Hasmonean dynasty, began to act exactly like the ruthless Hellenistic kings they had just bled to defeat. Just consider John Hyrcanus, the son of Simon. To maintain his control and expand his borders, he actually went out and hired foreign mercenaries. He aggressively conquered his neighbors to the south, the Idumeans, and literally forced them at sword point to be circumcised and accept Jewish law. He then marched his armies north and totally destroyed the rival Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. Yes, they had won their freedom, but a lot of folks argued they were rapidly losing their soul in the process. And it gets worse. As the Hasmonean leaders decided to consolidate their absolute power by holding both the title of king and the title of high priest, which traditionalists felt was an illegal, deeply corrupt power grab, the nation began fracturing heavily from within. Society completely split into these bitter, warring factions. On one side, you had the Pharisees. They became staunch enemies of the Hasmonean dynasty, constantly urging strict religious purity and separation from all this political corruption. On the exact opposite side, you had the Sadducees. These were the wealthy, aristocratic, and priestly elite who strongly allied with the rulers and happily embraced this new political power and Hellenistic leaning. This intense internal division, it sets up the exact religious and political landscape you encounter right on page 1 of the New Testament. So what's the ultimate takeaway from this explainer? Well, these 400 years forged a profoundly resilient people. A people who could survive the Persians, completely outlast the Greeks, and violently overthrow the Seleucids to win back their freedom. But as the dark, inevitable shadow of the Roman Empire looms on the horizon in 63 BC, ready to march its legions into a deeply divided Jerusalem, we're left with a really chilling thought. we have to ask, what happens when the biggest threat to your cultural identity is no longer the mighty empire outside your walls, but the bitter, uncompromising division right there within them? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the crucible of history.